Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast. I'm Mary Imparato. I'm chair of the politics department here at the college, and I'm joined by Doug Bandow. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He is author of a work called Foreign Follies and a syndicated columnist. He's worked in the Reagan administration. We're so happy to have him here. He's going to be giving a speech later on to our students and some faculty. And we just really like to discuss sort of his topic. If you kind of give us a sense of, the topic of the talk is when to go to war. And I know you've been writing about this for a few decades now. And it seems like the complexion of the answer to that question maybe changes or maybe it doesn't. What's going to be kind of maybe the gist of what you have to say?
Grew up on military bases. My father was in the Air Force. I have a great degree of respect for the military. And one of my views is you don't risk people's lives without a really good reason. And it strikes me that U.S. policy for many years has essentially treated, the joke is that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. For the United States, we have the most powerful military on earth, so there's a tendency to assume that every problem requires military action. And I think that's an extraordinarily bad way to look at it. The founders were very, very cognizant of the danger of military misuse. They set up a system that required Congress to decide on war. They made very clear they wanted to make it hard to go to war, and they had a good reason for that. So much of my writing basically explores that for the most part, I don't think we should be going to war for a lot of the things that we do, especially where presidents unilaterally throw the military out there. Go to war and vary. Is small and big, but nevertheless, the costs are very high. And I'd like to see us have a much higher standard before. We send young people off to potentially fight and die. The question is, what are we doing that for? What are the interests at stake? I think this is a very serious issue for us.
It's interesting because a lot of times people will say, well, we shouldn't be involved unless there's some vital national interest at stake. But that term, you could define that very broadly. Vital national interest could be almost anything to be justified. I'm just wondering how do you define that? So only get involved in conflicts where our interests are involved. I'm going to assume you probably define that a little more narrowly.
Yes, I mean everyone uses the formulation, and it makes sense. Do you believe you have an existential interest? Do you believe it's vital? The real meaning of those would suggest there aren't a lot of circumstances. For example, when people talk about trade is involved, I just don't think that's a reason for war. Historically, mercantilist states did so. But should we die for oil? Should you die because we want to have more exports? Should we die because we're worried about the price of a good? It strikes me that's really not a very good reason to go to war. You can talk much, if you're talking about would the economy crash, we're talking about the economic future of the country. Are we talking about access to resources that might, without which we couldn't have a military or without which our economy would crash? Then at least you're talking about something very serious. But in an awful lot of the cases, the economic interest is, it's important. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't try to advance it. To me, that's the big issue. The starting point should never be military. You can use the bully pulpit, there's diplomacy, there are economic measures, there's trade measures, there's sanctions. There's a whole host of things you can use, but you don't start at the military. And you should, when you talk about vital, I think you're talking much more about self-defense. You're talking about where loss of territory, loss of our constitutional liberties, threats to the American population. And it's not just, I go to a lot of places where most people won't go. Frankly, I don't believe the U.S. Marines should be on call to save me if I get myself in trouble. If I choose to go to some crazy place, why should America decide it has to go to war? Now, it'd be nice if the U.S. government tried to get me back, but I do think that, again, we have to say how important is that versus asking people in the military to die. Especially in today's world with nuclear weapons, when are we willing to put the U.S. homeland at risk? Because suddenly, you look at North Korea, they're building ICBMs and nuclear weapons. Well, suddenly the idea of defending South Korea means the U.S. homeland could be destroyed. We could lose cities and millions of people. That really transforms, I think, how you start looking at some of these decisions.
I think one of the prevailing interests for many decades was that we want to prevent the spread of communism. And at the end of the Cold War, that wasn't such a thing. But yet we have this you might say antagonistic relationship with Russia, right? We are using Ukraine in a sense as a proxy warrior for us. Could you kind of touch on the way in which, and even the North-South Korea thing, is this whole idea of like this ideological bent against communism? And I know you're very pro-civil liberties, so I'm sure you're not a pro-communist person, obviously, but to what extent should our military be involved to push back against those sort of communistic or authoritarian regimes?
No, I think communism is awful. I write a lot about it, especially for American Spectator Online. I have a piece that went up a couple weeks ago looking at a new book that came out promoting Leninism. And nowhere in the book do they mention the fact that millions of people died in Leninist states. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, you look at the Soviet Union and China, 100 million people between those two countries may have died. I mean, it's extraordinary, the numbers. I think that you don't just go against communism because of communism. You go against communism if it's a threat. So does it matter if communists have taken control of Ethiopia? Well, it's bad for the people of Ethiopia, but that doesn't necessarily mean we should go to war over that. The problem of the Soviet Union was it had global ambitions. It had an ideology that was an aggressive one. And the fear was that if you have one power that controls Eurasia, if you have a power that has dominant position in Asia and Europe, that's what we wanted to make sure the Nazis didn't get. Well, you don't want the communists to have it either. And I think what's changed critically is that Russia is not the Soviet Union. Now, Vladimir Putin's a bad dude, but quite honestly, the U.S. government doesn't care if people are bad dudes. I mean, the U.S. government sucks up to Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. I call him, Crown Prince Slice and Dice. I mean, he murdered and sliced up someone who I knew, Jamal Khashoggi, is somebody I was on a panel with and I had lunch with. Wow. This is a grotesque regime, but it doesn't threaten us in terms of kind of national interest in the sense of defense. So we actually work with him because we view it as being more important than being against him. So I think that you have to start making judgments not as is a government bad, but a question is what is its impact on America? And that doesn't mean you want to help the government, and you may very well want to undercut it. You can talk about sanctions. You can certainly use diplomacy. You might decide you want to help countries that are threatened by it. But I don't think that means you want to view the U.S. military as a starting point. I mean, the question of what happens with the North Korea. Laos is a communist country. I visited Laos. Laos threatens no one. Now, I would like to see the regime gone because the people of Laos are in fact oppressed. But the people are oppressed around the world. Central Asia, these are no longer communist regimes. A lot of oppression there. There's been a coup d'etat in Niger. Well, should we go to war there because of a coup? Well, we suck up to the regime in Egypt, which is far more repressive than in Niger. So, I mean, I think we have to recognize that international affairs has an awful lot of prudence, an awful lot of practicality involved. So morality is very important as well. But it's very hard to have a policy that's only directed by morality because that gets you into potentially a lot of wars.
Yeah, I wonder how much this appeal to freedom and, the mission in Iraq was called Operation Enduring Freedom, and George W. Bush famously said they hate us for our freedoms. And so, the American public, people tend to get a sense that we are devoted to spreading democracy and freedom around the globe, and that's just not how foreign policy minds think. Or is there anybody who seriously sort of has that view, or are we getting away from that in general? I mean,
well, there certainly are people who believe that should be the lodestar of our foreign policy, and typically you think of kind of more of liberal interventionism, humanitarian interventionism, and it's out there. But in most cases, it's frankly fraudulent. I mean, President Biden came into office and said human rights would be the top, point of his foreign policy. Well, suddenly he wanted more oil. He showed up in Saudi Arabia and basically begged the Saudis to provide more oil. They didn't. They really kicked him around. But recently he's been proposing that the U.S. military should offer a security guarantee to the Saudis, that American service personnel should potentially die on behalf of the Saudi royal family. So what happened to all of his interests in human rights? Out the window. I mean, we give a lot of money to Egypt. Egypt is far more repressive today than it was 10 years ago. Well, what happened to human rights? Bahrain has a major U.S. naval base. Forget human rights there. The Saudis put troops in to ensure a minority Sunni monarchy over a Shia population held control. Human rights went out the window. The point is, there's always that pressure of national interest, and to my mind is ultimately the U.S. government's primary mission is to its own people. That is those who it represents, those whose society it's protecting, and those who it expects to fight on its behalf. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about others. I think the morality comes in as a limiting factor. And we have a lot to answer for there. I mean, the problem in Iraq was hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died because we blew the place up. Well, that blood is on somebody's hands. Now, we didn't kill everybody, but there are a lot of people who recognize you go in, you take out a regime, you don't leave in what you need, you kind of foster radical forces, it's going to have a bad outcome.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we have to answer for that. I mean, if we've subsidized a lot of repressive regimes. Now, during the Cold War, we went authoritarian versus the communists, and I got that. But a lot of those authoritarian regimes, really committed a lot of grievous human rights violations. So even that is a very tough, policy to do. What point do you try to put human rights first, especially if it might undercut you in terms of, kind of your own survival? I think these are ones you can't really make an ideological decision. It's much more of a practical balance.
Okay. Yeah, a couple of areas I'm thinking that rising powers, developing nations, I'm thinking like China and India, and we're trying to skirt, allies with India, I suppose, right? We had that Howdy Modi event and seemed like a good guy and an ally, and China, we make kind of the boogeyman, and President Xi is maybe dangerous, and I'm just wondering, is that sort of an accurate picture? Should we be kind of throwing our weight behind India in that region of the world? And is China really that big a threat that we gotta, don't let them get Taiwan? We gotta make that the red line in the sand they can't cross. What do you think about that part of the world?
Well, there's a huge amount in that question. I mean, China is probably the greatest challenge that we face, but I don't think it's primarily a military challenge. Look, no one that I'm aware of seriously believes that the Chinese Armada is going to show up and try to seize Hawaii and land on the West Coast. The last thing the Chinese want is a military conflict with America. What the Chinese want is what America wants, or has, which is domination of its own region. I mean, when American officials say we don't believe in spheres of influence, they're lying. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine is a sphere of influence. Yeah. I mean, John Bolton, in the last administration, talking about Venezuela, talked about the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. complained because the Russians and Chinese were involved in Venezuela. What is that but a sphere of influence? Yeah. So we're shocked that Russia wants to dominate Ukraine, but of course we expect to dominate every country in Latin America. Well, that's what the Chinese want. I mean, the Chinese, that gives them security. Now, we may not want to allow that, but then we have to take into account are we prepared for a war 6,000 miles from home? The projection of power is extraordinarily expensive. The Chinese don't have to have a dozen aircraft carriers. What they need to do is be able to sink aircraft carriers. The question is, can we project power, especially what will our allies do? So I think our focus on China should be, look, this is a Leninist state. Not so much Marxist-Leninist. I mean, they have capitalists in the Communist Party. This is not a communism of which we're normally thinking, but it's Leninist. I mean, and Xi Jinping's a really bad dude. Before that, I've been to China more than 20 times, and my experience in China is that up through about a decade ago, it was kind of loose authoritarianism. You couldn't criticize the party, but you could have a bit of a policy debate. They had independent journalists who could, operate at the provincial level. I mean, religious liberty was growing. I mean, you basically, they kind of don't do politics and just, I mean, I look, one of my trips there, I looked over at a bumper in Beijing and somebody had the traditional Christian fish on their bumper in Beijing. I took a picture of it, wrote an article, and we used the picture. All of that's disappeared. I mean, the crackdown over the last decade has been extraordinary. It's on religious people, it's on Hong Kong, it's on Xinjiang, it's on, the independent journalists are gone, human rights lawyers. I mean, it's bad. But, I mean, all of that itself doesn't threaten the United States. Now, the economic issues get very complex. I mean, trade issues I don't think threaten us, but there are some issues of, do you want, for example, Chinese, could they gain domination of AI, artificial intelligence, and semiconductor chips? So the question is, we're very concerned about a Leninist state that can kind of conscript its private sector could become threatening. So to my mind, there's a lot of those issues, but then you want to work with your allies, and that gets complicated. We do subsidies for electrical vehicles, and suddenly the Europeans and the South Koreans get mad because we're doing it against them as well as China.
Yeah.
But I'd say that if you're looking at China, you don't want to treat them as an enemy because that kind of turns them into one. But you want to think of a broader kind of how do you constrain them, and part of that's working with other countries. And a balance of power is very useful. The point is, just as China can we talk about anti-access area denial, of trying to prevent us from operating close to their shore, the Japanese can do that. If the Japanese have missiles and they can sink, Chinese ships, South Korea, Taiwan, and India comes into play. Now, India is a democracy, but it's kind of an authoritarian democracy. I mean, Modi is not a nice guy. This is a guy who threw his, leading opponent into jail. It has ruthless kind of Hindu nationalism. I mean, Christians, Muslims, and others suffer. And they don't want to be a military ally of us. They're not going to go to war. Their primary dispute with China is over the Himalayas. I mean, they may fight some short border wars. They're not going to have a kind of a nuclear war over that territory. But India does matter in terms of trade. It matters in terms of naval power. It has relations throughout Asia. So our policy should be to have good relations with them. They don't want to be pushed around, but the idea is they help constrain China. China has boundaries with land boundaries of 14 countries, and several countries, and in many ways, kind of water borders. It's very insecure in certain ways. We want to encourage that insecurity. But again, that doesn't mean we want a war with China. Look, a war would be catastrophic. So I think, and we need to play the long game. Chinese students who I've dealt with are nationalists. They don't like us criticizing their government, but they typically don't like government controls over their lives. So the question is, how do you try to keep information flowing? How do you appeal to them so over the long term, when they're in leadership, they may take China in a different direction? Those are the things I think we want to be talking about with our friends. Donald Trump launched a trade war against China. At the same time, he launched a trade war against Europe and against Canada and against South Korea. Well, that's crazy. You need to set your priorities. If you want to deal with China, working with the Europeans, working with South Korea, Japan, that's very important. None of them want a war, but working together, we may be, very well create some incentives that help, push China in the right direction.
It's interesting you bring up Donald Trump, because when you were kind of describing your views on foreign policy, I was like, oh, this kind of sounds like America first, and take care of her own situation first and only get involved in sort of most drastic situations. But I'm trying to figure out, so where's the daylight between you and Trump? It seems like you're not too much a protectionist.
I'm an internationalist in the sense that I love the world. I love traveling the world. I'm going to China in May and June. I'm going to be in the United Kingdom. There's a reasonable chance that in July I'll be in Mongolia. In September I'm going to be in India. I'm going to Spain in November. I was recently in Egypt. I find the most interesting thing that I do is travel, because the world is endlessly fascinating. And I like immigration. I think immigration enriches the United States. I think that trade, should be relatively free. That trade, I think, also enriches the U.S. and other countries. I encourage Americans. I tell Americans that the best ambassadors for America are Americans, not formal ambassadors. For the most part, people around the world like Americans. Americans can be loud and a bunch of other things, but for the most part, people in other countries really enjoy Americans. They like the freedom they see. They like the generosity they see. That to me, I want Americans to go overseas. I want them to understand other countries. I want to bring people here. So in all of those ways, I'm very open to the world. But I'm very skeptical of the use of the military as the primary mechanism of dealing with the world. I don't view internationalism as bombing other countries. I find neocons and others who seem to be think this is wonderful. The true measure of internationalism is how many people you're willing to kill. I just don't think that's the right way to do it. So I would say that Trump is kind of a Jacksonian unilateralist, a Jacksonian nationalist that can be very interventionist in certain ways, but typically is unilateral. But is very much, doesn't like doing it for kind of, save the world, isn't really interested in promoting human rights. It's a much more narrower sense of American interest, but it still would be broader than mine. So I would say, we should go to, I'd say in many ways, if you want to use the military, it kind of is America first. That is, the starting point is this community, our political community. Are we threatened? Is it something that warrants risking the lives of Americans? I mean, that you put people, service people in uniform, and you send them overseas. Well, you need to have a really good reason for it. My nephew is a SEAL. My father was career Air Force. My uncle was in the Navy. The associate pastor of my church recently retired from the Marine Corps. My friend who takes care of my mail and stuff when I travel is retired Navy. You know, I mean, these are people. These are real people. So, to my mind, is there's a tendency. The famous anecdote that Colin Powell told in his autobiography was in Madeleine Albright, who was then, I think, Secretary of State. It was either when she was Secretary of State or UN Ambassador, but she said, what's the use of having this wonderful military you keep talking about if we never use it? And the next line in his autobiography was, I almost had an aneurysm. I mean, Colin Powell served in Vietnam. People died under him. Yeah. So this notion that American personnel should be kind of gambit pawns in a global chess game, or whatever, horrified him. And to me, that I think Washington has kind of taken that attitude that, military is just another thing you do. And to my mind, no. It's a last resort. It has huge implications. It almost always has surprises. Nobody goes to war thinking they're going to lose. I mean, the American Civil War was supposed to be easy. Both sides thought it'd be 1 or 2 battles. 750,000 or so, okay, that's the current estimate, died. That's 8 million people in today's population.
Wow.
So you don't want to do this unless you really have to. I think the interesting thing with Trump is that I think there's an element of that there, that he doesn't get, look, I'm not a fan of President Trump, but that's one where I think he gets kind of unfairly hit. He showed a real reluctance to go to war for things he didn't think were worth it. When the Iranians shot down an American drone, there were discussions about us attacking them militarily, and apparently he essentially said was, you want me to kill 100 people because they shot a drone down? That there was that sense that he understood, no, this isn't worth it. And I think that's what I want in a president, is to say, no, that's not worth it. What are the other tools of foreign policy?
Yeah. So I think one of the areas right now where we're considering, hey, what's our role in this area? I know it's a hot button, but what should we do? And I think President Biden actually has trouble on his hands. I'm thinking about Israel, in the sense that, Biden's going for re-election, and he's got his party sort of divided between the people who are like very pro-Palestinian and those who are pro-Israeli. And I don't know what he's going to do to appease both sides, but just thinking about what's going on in Israel and Hamas, Iran's getting in the fray, like, what are the options on the table here, especially for a Biden in the bind he's in?
Look, I mean, this is one of the most emotional issues you can get. And you'll find different religious communities obviously have some rather different views of this. I mean, Biden, his problem is that he has always been very, very pro-Israel. He's said he's the most pro-Israel president ever. As an American politician, he has gotten more money from Israeli and pro-Israeli interests than any other politician. He's always been seen as being very strongly on that side. And everything he said during the current crisis has been, essentially, I will not do anything to impede Israel's military action. So, yeah, and if you put it that way, you have no leverage. And I think that's what it's shown. And he's been pushed to take account of Palestinians, but historically he's never shown much interest in the status of Palestinians. Like, my view is, number one is like the current issue in terms of Iran. Israel has the strongest conventional force plus nuclear weapons in the region. They have a military. I mean, they should be the ones defending themselves. There's no reason we should feel the need to come in. And I worry that to the extent you say we will protect Israel even when they attack somebody else's embassy, I mean, the moral hazard there is that, well, suddenly you just feel you're
carte blanche.
Yeah, you have immunity. I mean, nobody can do anything to you. That, I think, is very dangerous. So it's not just Israel. I mean, we've had that issue with some of the other allies we have. I mean, I think that's in terms of Europeans and South Koreans and others. If they feel that the U.S. is going to back them up no matter what, then in fact they're going to be more aggressive and dangerous. Look, on the issue of Israel, I mean, to my mind, the great tragedy here is that the U.S. position should be both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. And Israel, to my mind, the big issue for Israel is not external; it's internal. I mean, by a lot of accounting, today there are more Palestinians in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean than there are Jews. So the question is, how does Israel be both democratic and Jewish? And unfortunately, I mean, the reality is that the West Bank is an apartheid state, which, I mean, you go there, it's militarized. I mean, anyone who goes there, lots of Christians go there to go to Bethlehem, but you need to go to Hebron, you need to go to Ramallah, you need to sit through checkpoints. I mean, you need to see how people live, including Christians. See, this is, people completely lose the context of Arab Christians. Talk to Arab Christians and what they go through, you can understand the frustration. I mean, what happened, Gaza was essentially an open air, prison. Now, what Hamas did was horrendous, but you can simultaneously say what Hamas did was horrendous and could not be justified, and separately say Israel's treatment of Gaza, was, you can't do that and not expect that they're going to have problems. 60 years of an occupation, I mean, Israelis wouldn't put up with that, Americans wouldn't put up with that. So to my mind, the only way for Israel to have security is to work out something which protects the rights of Palestinians as well as Israelis. And my fear is that U.S. policy has never tried to strike a balance. The politics there domestically pushes it on one side. And that's where I think Biden's problem is, that the Democratic Party is changing, and changing in very important ways. In fact, you're even seeing younger evangelicals who are much less pro-Israel than their parents. And it's the strongest, I tell people, I've been on webinars and kind of interviews where people will talk about the Jewish lobby. I say, it's not the Jewish lobby, it's the Israeli lobby. And frankly, the strongest proponents of the Israeli lobby are not Jews. Jews tend to be progressive on politics. A lot of American Jews are very disturbed about, I mean, they're not fans of Benjamin Netanyahu. They're certainly not fans of people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others in the cabinet. That for them, that causes them a very real problem. The strongest supporters are evangelicals, evangelical Christians. So don't conflate the religion with the state. When you're dealing with the Israeli state, we're dealing with politically with a state that, though it is Jewish, that is not the issue. It's a question of how the state operates as a state. And there, I think the U.S. needs to probably try to put a little more distance there, because ultimately, I think it's a problem not only for Americans, but I think for Israelis, that the long term, Israel needs to have an accommodation with Palestinians. If it doesn't, I don't think the Hamas violence is the last. I think that it's going to be repeated unless there's some outcome that Palestinians can accept too.
Yeah, I think in that answer, I'm hearing that, the U.S. role in sort of backing up our allies sometimes makes conflicts a little more unable to be resolved. And that is one of the things that, you were talking about, okay, we get involved when our, serious national interests are at stake, but yet we have the NATO agreement where we get involved if one of our allies are being attacked or harmed. Like, we're sort of pledging ourselves to defend our allies, and NATO is really not confined to the North Atlantic anymore, right? It's already coming to Russia's doorstep. So I just want to ask, Trump was not a fan of NATO. In fact, he threatened them that he's going to, why are we paying the bill here? You all have to step up and contribute 2% of GDP to your own defense. So, and NATO was like a Cold War instrument. So is NATO outdated? Are those agreements to support our allies, is this some kind of the source of the problem, part of the problem with Russia?
Look, I think NATO made sense after World War II. Europe was ruined. The Soviets had advanced into Central Europe. Eisenhower and other American leaders were very explicit. They did not want a permanent U.S. troop presence. This was a temporary shield to allow Europe to rebuild. We turned it into basically defense welfare. There's a defense dole. And in recent years, I mean, why Montenegro? Montenegro has under 4,000 troops. This is not a serious security addition. Every addition, to NATO, it doesn't strengthen NATO, it increases our defense obligations. And the question is why? 80 years after the end of World War II, Europeans have 10 times Russia's GDP, like 3.5 times its population. Maybe it's time for them to take on these responsibilities. They never had to. I mean, American presidents would whine and complain and, cajole and everything. And the Europeans understood the U.S. is going to do it anyway, so, why bother? Right. And in fact, I don't blame the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans took America's measure and said, we want to spend our money on welfare, and we know you're going to defend us, so, we're happy with the arrangement. So I think, Trump, was very useful, and he articulated rather more caustically what other presidents had basically said. And my reaction is what we should do is, NATO should be a European defense organization. Europeans should have a defense organization. But I think the expansion, Vladimir Putin bears blame for the war. He started the war. But if U.S. and allied officials lied to Russia, they promised not to expand NATO, and everyone knew the risk. Back in 2008, Fiona Hill, who was in the NSC under Trump, Fiona Hill wrote about this. She briefed President George W. Bush and Vice President Cheney and said, if you bring Ukraine into NATO, you're very likely to get a violent reaction. She is no Putinist. She was explaining what was well known. William Burns, who's the current CIA director, was then ambassador to Russia. And in 2008, he sent a cable back to the same president, the same vice president, saying that he could find no one in Moscow in leadership who did not view bringing Ukraine into NATO as anything but a direct challenge to Russian interests. The war against Yugoslavia was an aggressive war. This was not a defensive alliance. We used it offensively. That had a major impact on Russian public opinion, not just elites, but the public turning them against. Vladimir Putin's a bad guy, but in 2001, he was the first foreign leader to call Bush after 9/11 and offer support. And 2 weeks later, he gave a very accommodating speech to the Bundestag, the German parliament, talking about, we understand there's a special relationship between the U.S. and Europe, and he indicated he wanted Russia to be part of this new emerging order. 2007, he gave a much tougher speech at the Munich Security Conference, and he asked, this expansion of NATO, how can we view this as a friendly act? And he talked about the country that took the most aggressive stance and was most militarily active, by which he meant the United States, as in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Something happened in those years that changed his attitude towards the U.S. And European officials and American officials bear blame for that and want to take no responsibility for it. And again, I want to emphasize, Putin bears the responsibility for this war. It's horrendous and it's awful. But so do allied officials who, in my view, they share the blood. And they should be held accountable. And so far they run from that and don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of get that full scope and have Americans consider, where we stand in sort of taking responsibility for who we ally ourselves with. All right, well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I can't wait for the talk later on. I thank you all for joining us on Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast. And please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, God bless.